webinar today by Red Fox Education. Now, this webinar is all about Task 1 writing. And as you probably know, in the writing test for IELTS, we have to write 2 essays. Task 1 is a report about visual data, and Task 2 is a discursive essay on a given topic. Task 1 is actually harder than Task 2, as we'll find out today, primarily because there are so many different question types, and you do need specific language to answer each of them. Statistically, candidates on the IELTS test score lower on Task 1 than on Task 2, so the evidence is there also. Now then, let's look at what we'll do today. Here is the agenda. We'll talk firstly about the grading criteria for Task 1, and the main part of that in the context of what we're talking about today is the task achievement part of the score. That would lead us into key essay components, and then we'll take a detailed look at each of the essay types. So, I'd just like to say at the start that you are welcome to ask questions. Please leave those towards the end of the webinar. You can raise a question simply by typing it into the chat box, and I'll pick those up towards the end. So let's start with the grading criteria. And as you probably know, there are 4 elements to this: task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, which is basically our vocabulary, and grammatical range and accuracy. And there are 25% of the marks allocated for each of these. So each are equally important. And I always think it's very good to have an understanding of how things are graded, because if you do, you will know what you need to deliver to the examiner in order to get a high score. So quite often an examination of this is really useful for you in being able to get the highest possible achievement for yourself in all elements of the IELTS test. So let's look at this grading criteria, and in particular, the task achievement element. What do we have to do to get a high task achievement score? Well, here are some extracts from the grading criteria. To get the highest score of band 9, which a tiny percentage of students actually manage, you have to fully satisfy all of the requirements of the task and clearly present a fully developed response. So that's the sort of answer that your examiners or tutors may achieve if they took the IELTS test. Band 7 or 7.5 is a very acceptable and reasonable target for most students, for most candidates. With a score of 7, certainly with 7.5, you will get accepted at almost all universities around the world in terms of the English-speaking requirement. So what does band 7 say? Here we have to cover the requirements of the task, present a clear overview of the main trends, differences, or stages, and clearly present and highlight key features. But the answer could be more fully extended. So, as you can see, there is still a little margin for error in the criteria, even when we're talking of achieving a band 7. So, the key components that leads us into this part of the talk. What do we need to satisfy the task achievement score? The first thing we need is to correctly introduce the data. So to tell the examiner exactly what your report is about. And of course, we get that information from the question wording and the data and elements that you see on the chart, table, plan, or what have you. We must include an overview of the main points or trends. Now, overview means a general picture of what is the most important fact or facts that we can see from this visual data. This means we don't want any detail in here at all. If you have detail and specify figures or what have you, then the examiner will read this as not having provided a satisfactory overview, and your score for this element will be no higher than 5. So the overview needs to be in general terms, and it needs to select the right information. So what do you see on this graph, this chart, this table? That is the main point or main trend from the data presented in front of you. Then we need to select and write about the main points, including only what is important. This is your task, to select and report the main features. So we don't want things that are insignificant or unimportant. If you write about everything that you see, you're not complying with the instructions. You're not then highlighting the importance, the important features, the main points. You're not doing that. Related to this is including any information that is irrelevant. So in task 1, we do not give any opinions. We do not try and explain the data. We do not make any assumptions. We simply report the data as we see it, selecting and reporting the key features. We're also told in the question rubric to make comparisons where relevant. So even as we will see later, where the main focus of the question is on something else, such as describing changes over a timeline or identifying the changes in maps over a period of time, we still need to make some comparisons because that's what we're told to do. And finally, the final component is to write 150 words as a minimum. There's no maximum, but we must hit that word count or we lose 1 point from your task achievement score, and that will then seriously affect your overall writing score. So, what are the other grading criteria? Well, as we mentioned, we have cohesion and coherence, which we'll get from correct paragraphing, from setting out all of your points in a logical sequence that is clear to follow, and by using the right words and phrases to connect all of your points together. Now, this means both transitions from paragraph to paragraph and from sentence to sentence, and connecting clauses within your sentences. It also includes avoiding repetition in your language, which is why we need to learn a lot of stuff to correctly answer task 1 with a high score. Vocabulary and grammar sometimes are very difficult to get a really high score in task 1, certainly more difficult than task 2. If you have an extensive vocabulary and your grammar is quite strong, it's definitely then more difficult to achieve higher scores in this part of the test than it is in task 2. Again, because we have to only use the specific language that is relevant for each type of question. So let's look at what each of these question types is. On the screen now, we have a sort of basic guide to the different types of questions we might encounter. Line graphs, bar charts, tables, and other forms of data as well. Now, in terms of a timeline question, most students who typically think of a line graph, but these questions can also appear on bar charts or tables, and we'll see some examples of those shortly. So what do we need for a successful high-scoring answer in relation to a question with a timeline? Well, the main focus of the question is describing the different trends that you see from the data and describing the changes over that timeline. And this requires some very specific language, both in terms of our grammar and our vocabulary. So we need a range of different verbs and nouns for describing upward or downward movements. We need a range of adjectives and adverbs for describing changes that in terms of the speed, which is the rate of the change, or the size, which is the degree of the change. And then we're looking to combine these together in collocations. So an adjective plus noun or a verb plus adverb. And we need to vary our sentence types so that we're not writing the same sentence structure to describe these changes again and again. We also have to make comparisons where relevant, as we found out earlier. And in timeline questions, we do this by looking at the different categories and expressing similarities and differences. So let's take a look at some of these question types, the different forms that we might see. Firstly, here's a line graph type question. And as we see with the line graph, we have the timeline on the horizontal axis and the measurement. In this case, it's percentages, but it may not be. It could be numbers or currency or something else. And we'll see that on the horizontal axis. There will be a key somewhere. Here it's at the bottom here to describe the different categories. Sometimes it's at the side, sometimes it's at the top. But we'll have a key with the different categories, which shows us which line is which on the graph. Now, if we look at this particular graph, and we're looking at how to pick out the overview, as we mentioned earlier, clearly the main mover is hydroelectricity. It starts as the lowest form of energy produced in Canada at a very low 7% or something. And by the end of the time frame, it is significantly higher than anything else. So it's gone from being the lowest type of energy produced to the highest. Clearly, that is the main point that we see. Now, how would we group this together and paragraph it? Because crude oil production is also really high. It's also very significant. It does fall over the history of this timeline, but it remains really strong in terms of its percentage. Whereas coal and natural gas are on a gradual fall from start to finish. So what would we have to do here? We need to make those comparisons. We can contrast hydroelectricity with everything else. We can express the similarity between coal and gas. But the main thing we need to do is to describe the changes, and hydroelectricity here has a very rapid and continuous upward movement. All of the rest are relatively slow and downward. So again, we're sort of comparing there also. So timeline question we'll tend to find like this. We'll have about 4, 5, maybe 6 changes to describe. And this is where having that knowledge of the different verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and other expressions that we need comes into play, because we should try and describe every change using a different collocation, and also try and vary our sentences, our sentence structure, as often as possible in describing those changes. Our next slide shows us a bar chart, which is also over a timeline. Again, you see the timeline on the horizontal axis rather. And again, the measurement here is in percentages, which we see on the vertical axis. We have percentage of electricity imported into 3 different European countries. We'll see on here, we see a falling pattern for Denmark, but an increasing pattern for the other 2 countries. So there's an immediate comparison that we can see. Again, we're looking at describing these changes both in terms of the size and the rate. For both for both Sweden and the UK, we have a gradual or steady increase. But for Denmark, we have a really rapid fall. So there we have to really look at how we describe those changes and choose the right words for the situation. Now, let's move on and look at a table. Tables are not as pretty as line graphs or bar charts. It's really just a box of figures, so it's not very pleasing on the eye. And that can really make it slightly more difficult. But essentially, this question is exactly the same. We answer it in exactly the same way. We have the timeline, which is on the top row here. And then we have 4 categories and a whole load of figures. So again, we have to look at these figures carefully to see what the patterns are, what the trends are, what is similar, what is different, and what has changed, and describe those changes using the best possible words. Germany, for example, has a slight fall from 1980 to 1990, but thereafter, it has a very dramatic decrease, plummets in the next 10 years, and drops by half. After that, we've got a very slow change, which is gradual towards the end of the timeline. So this is how we have to try and pick out these, describing these different changes. We have a completely opposite pattern in the USA. So again, we bring out that contrast in those 2 particular categories. Our next question type is comparison questions. Now, these are questions there where we don't have a timeline or the data is from a particular point in time. And these can be on bar charts or tables. Here, we need to focus on the language that describes differences and similarities, and also making different types of comparison, comparatives, superlatives, expressions of equality or inequality. Let's look at some of these types of questions. Here's a typical bar chart, student numbers at Loughborough University in 2012. Now this time we see the categories, the different subjects on the horizontal axis. The measurement is always on the vertical axis here. Again, here we've got simple numbers, and we have a key telling us that we've got both male and female students. Now, for a bar chart, as we said earlier, the main thing here is drawing comparisons on the data that is presented on the chart before us. Now, when we look at this, we see 3 subjects with very big differences between the genders, and 3 subjects where the difference is quite minimal. So that is one of our key themes. We also see in 5 of the 6 subjects, more male students than female. That's what should leap out at you as the main point for the overview. A secondary point would be that biology is the most popular subject. We then describe the categories making comparisons. So for example, if we take physics, we see that this subject has the fewest number of female students. It has the greatest disparity between men and women, and a very high contingent of male students in general, over 200. Chemistry and zoology we would write about together with physics, because these also are the ones with the big differences between gender numbers. Biology and medicine we'd write about together and express the similarity. They're the 2 most popular courses overall. There is a very small difference between men and women, although it's still in favor of male students. Botany we could include in the same paragraph as biology and medicine, because again, the difference is small, or you could include it in its own separate paragraph, because it's the one that's contrasting. This is the only category, the only subject that has a higher contingent of female scholars rather than male. That's a very key point that we need to bring out. So you can see that we're looking mainly at making as many comparisons as we can and trying to vary those comparisons using both positive comparisons and negative ones. Botany, for example, has the fewest number of male students. That's a negative comparison. The next slide shows us a table for comparisons. And we really want to hope that we don't get a table for comparison in our examination, because in my view, these are really the hardest type of questions. The information is usually quite difficult to decipher. This one in particular has appeared on an examination. It's really quite a hard question to get to grips with, because we have comparisons between two different cities, but each of them are also compared with the national average in terms of expenditure percentage. So when we see minus 12.5, this means below the national average. So we're comparing this West Bilton figure for cost of housing with the national average, but we're also comparing it with the other city, which is substantially above that average. So again, they're quite difficult in grouping the information and then in making the comparisons. But of course, we have to just try our best here and see what it actually is. So we see with one of these cities is clearly more affluent than the other. In most categories, the percentages are well above the national average, other than unemployment. And we wouldn't really see unemployment in this particular city if we have if we can have high salaries and the people here can afford private medical insurance and private education for their children. The opposite is the case in the other city, where the costs of housing are lower, the salaries are lower. So this is clearly a less affluent place. And the unemployment rate here is higher. So again, we're just really bringing out those comparisons between the data. Right, now then, let's just move on to look at pie charts. Pie charts typically have 2 or 3 charts, occasionally just one, and in which case it'll have lots of data on it. The data may be from different types. We've got 2 or 3 charts. The data may be from different times. And in that case, we need a combination of the language we've discussed. So describing changes over time combined with comparisons between categories. Alternatively, the data will be from the same point in time. So the focus here would be on the comparison of this data within the different categories. We need an understanding of percentages and fractions, because the pie charts will always be measured in percentage, so we don't want to keep repeating percent and percentage all of the time. And one way we can do this is by using fractions instead, and also using quantifiers and qualifiers to vary the language. Now, I'll just explain that by reference to a chart. Here's one with time differences. So, for example, when we see on this chart 25% for the global population, or that part of the global population within Europe in 1900, 25% is 1/4. So instead of using percent, we can say 1/4 or a quarter. And that's a way of avoiding the repetition of the same words again and again. So this one has a timeline, sort of, only 2 charts. So we do need to make some comparison between the different times, and that will involve us in using some of the language for describing changes. Europe, for example, has dropped significantly from 25%, a quarter, to only 15% in 2000. That's quite a sizable drop. Some of the smaller regions, or the smaller populated regions, have had huge increases. 4.5% to 10% in Africa is more than doubled. 3% to 8% in South and Central America, again, even more. So again, categorize the paragraphs together. We would talk about here, we talk about Asia and Europe together in one paragraph. These two are clearly the most important categories. They're the largest percentages, and they're the only 2 regions where the global population has actually fallen. Now, with a question like this, it's also important to understand the language we need for the categories. Many of my students for this particular question have said that the number of people in Asia has fallen, for example, but that's not the case at all. The number of people in Asia in 2000 compared with 1900 is enormously higher, but it's the percentage of the population as part of the global population that has fallen. So we need to make sure we can express that correctly. And here is a pie chart where we simply comparing the data and again, focusing on the comparisons. Here we have only one point in time, but we have both male and female graduate salaries to contend with, again, in the different percentages. Now, we're running out of time, so let's skip through the other question types as quickly as we can. Maps and plans, many students find these very difficult. They're not difficult. The only reason they find them difficult is because they don't really practice them. Because they ask someone like me, and I'll tell you that we don't get maps or plans very often, maybe 5-8% of the time. But we should still practice them and understand how to write them in case we get one in our examination. They can be easier. We would normally get 2 or 3 maps or plans. It'll be the same place, but at different times. The main test really for this is the verb tenses. What are the actual times that are being shown on these maps or plans? If they're both from the past or all from the past, we will need mainly past perfect. If we're looking at the past being compared with the present, we'll need present perfect. And some give us future projections. Changes that are proposed to be made to a park or a supermarket layout or something like that. So here we need a combination of passive and future simple for past, for both the past, present, and future. We use the language we need to make projections. The vocabulary for these questions is mainly the different types of verbs we need. So things like convert and relocate, reconstruct, develop, these types of verbs are what we need for these types of questions. The overview also is both general and specific. Lots will have changed in these maps, otherwise there'd be nothing to write about. So we need a general statement, such as the town, village, or museum, what have you, has been completely transformed over the time frame, something like that. And then we need to be a little more specific and highlight the main point. It might be that if it's a village at one time compared with another, that a village that was predominantly agricultural in nature is now mainly residential. That would be the more specific but still general point for our overview. Selecting key features is a little different with this question type because every change on the map is important, so we need to talk about each of them in turn. So again, selecting the key features can be a little easier. Again, we're running out of time quickly, so quickly skip through these. Here's an example of maps. Here we've got 3 times from the past, and we would plot the changes from time to time as we go through our answer. Now, process diagrams, again, relatively straightforward like the maps and plans. The first thing to decide, is this a man-made process or a natural process? This one would be man-made, production of milk. This one would be natural, the life cycle of a silkworm. In each case, we look at the fact that we've got a set of different stages. That's usually our overview. And then again, every stage is important. So we have to plot the stages of the process one by one, turn by turn. Similarly to maps and plans, we've been using a lot of passive verbs here. Finally, we have multi-data. Now, multi-data is simply a combination of different forms of data like the line graph and pie chart, bar charts and table and so on. So it's really a combination of questions that we've already looked at. The key difference is the overview. If the data sets are in the same form, like two bar charts, so like this one, then there will usually be a direct link between them. So here we've got different types of qualification. So you can see the higher the qualification, the lower the rate of unemployment and the higher the salary. That's the direct link between the categories. Where the data is in different forms like this, a line graph and a bar chart, here there's no direct link. This one doesn't have a timeline. It's about the same topic, number of doctors in Ohio, but the information on each chart is different. So here we need to pick out the main point from each data set and focus on that. So that brings us to the end of our formal talk. I'd just like to tell you about what we do here at Red Fox in terms of our IELTS training. We have a series of webinars that we're rolling out over the next several months for the rest of the year, so you can join the webinars and you can look at our self-study products. You can buy that and it gives you access to study materials, videos, worksheets, and so on our website. We have online courses, which you can take either individually or in group classes. And we help you with mock tests and assessments. Pre-course assessment to get you in the right level of study and mock tests to assess your progress. What you can expect in our training is expert guidance from specialist educators. Your assigned teacher will be an IELTS expert with thousands of hours of practical teaching experience. The study materials that you see on the website and in the worksheets are all written by former IELTS examiners, and you get videos and accessible study materials with full administrative support from the Red Fox staff. So I thoroughly recommend that you take one of these products from us and pursue your studies. You have almost a guaranteed success rate by studying the course with us from start to finish before you take your examination. Okay, now then, just to look at some questions, I've got one question here saying, what does key features mean? Well, the key features means the important points from the data that you see. So let me take you back to, let's look at the first one. If we look at this, a key feature here is the increase on hydroelectricity. Now, if we look at the individual increases between 2000 and 2002, 2002, 2004, these are not individually important. The key point is the fact that it's a very quick and very large continuous increase. So we only need to describe the one change. And this is continuous and dramatic increase. So overall, the size of this change is significant. So that would be the key feature. We don't want to describe each individual change between the points in time on the timeline, because those are of relative insignificance. So that would be a key feature. Let's take another one at random. Let's look at this one. The key features here, it's not necessarily it's usually never the numbers of students, it's the differences between them. So a key feature with biology would be, it's the most popular course. There are more male students and female students than any other subject. That's the main feature when we look at that. Okay, so I hope that has successfully answered that question for you. Okay, now I've got another one from Ibrahim saying, could I explain something again, but I'm not sure what you want me to explain again. If you tell me, I'll try my best. Okay, otherwise, thank you. I've got another one here. Multi-type questions. We need, oh, yes, we do. Multi-data. Oh, let's go back to the multi-data questions then. I'll show you again. Wrong one. Okay. Now, I think you have there the overview, okay? When we have two charts that are the same form of data, here we've got two bar charts, you will normally find a direct link between them, and that will be the overview. So here we can see that people who have the highest form of qualification have the lowest chance of, and they make the most money. So that's the link. You have a job and you'll make more money. That's the link. When we look at this one, there's no direct link. We need to pick the main feature from each of the two charts and express that in our overview paragraph. Okay, so again, I hope that's answered the question. We haven't really time for any more, so thank you very much for joining our webinar today. And we hope we see you again as Red Fox students. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.